AD, we're back. All right, page 39, Paul Revere, 1735 to 1818. Most people know Paul Revere for his midnight ride. However, that fateful night was just a slice of this patriot's life. Professionally, Paul followed in his French father's footsteps as a master goldsmith, but the heavy British taxes required that Paul learn several other trades to help make ends meet, including dentistry and engraving. Paul noticed that others struggled similarly, and he quickly grew revolutionary-minded. In December of 1773, he helped to throw cases of tea at the Boston Tea Party. He spied on the British, rode for the Boston Committee of Correspondence, worked on the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, and engraved political cartoons. It was Paul who developed a lantern system to warn the people of British arrival. In the tower of the Old North Church in Boston, one lantern would be hung if the British approached by land, two if by sea. Upon seeing the signal in April of 1775, Paul and several other riders took off to warn people that the British were coming by sea. The Battle of Lexington Concord ensued, and, maybe thanks to Paul, the revolutionaries secured victory. Paul kept busy during the American Revolution and beyond, manufacturing gunpowder, printing the first American money, commanding Castle Williams at Boston Harbor, running a hardware store and foundry, and opening the first American copper rolling mill, a version of which is still in business today. The following excerpt is from Stories of Later American History by Wilbur Fisk Gordy, Chapter 3, The War Begins Near Boston. When Parliament passed the Boston Port Bill, the king believed that such severe punishment would not only put a stop to further rebellious acts, but would cause the colonists to feel sorry for what they had done and incline them once more to obey him. Imagine his surprise and indignation at what followed. As soon as General Gage ordered that the Massachusetts Assembly should hold no more meetings, the colonists made up their minds they would not be put down in this manner. They said, "The king has broken up the Assembly. Very well. We will form a new governing body and give it a new name, the Provincial Congress." And what do you suppose the chief business of this Congress was? To make ready for war. An army was called for, and provision made that a certain number of the men enlisted should be prepared to leave their homes at a minute's notice. These men were called Minutemen. Even while the patriots, for so the rebellious subjects of King George called themselves, were making these preparations, General Gage, who was in command of the British troops in Boston, had received orders from England to seize as traitors Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were the most active leaders. Of Samuel Adams you already know. John Hancock was president of the newly made Provincial Congress. General Gage knew that Adams and Hancock were staying for a while with a friend in Lexington. He had learned also through spies that Minutemen had collected some cannon and military stores in Concord, 20 miles from Boston and only 8 miles beyond Lexington. The British general planned, therefore, to send a body of troops to arrest the two leaders at Lexington, and then to push on and capture or destroy the stores at Concord. Although he acted with the greatest secrecy, he was unable to keep his plans from the watchful Minutemen. We shall see how one of these, Paul Revere, outwitted him. Perhaps you have read Longfellow's poem, which tells the story of the famous midnight ride taken by this fearless young man. Paul Revere had taken an active part in the Boston Tea Party, and the following year, with about 30 other young patriots, he had formed a society to spy out the British plans. I fancy that the daring and courage called for in this business appealed to the high spirits and love of adventure of these young men. Always on the watch, they were quick to notice any strange movement and report to such leaders as Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Dr. Joseph Warren. On the evening of April 18, 1775, Paul Revere and his friends brought the word to Dr. Warren that they believed General Gage was about to carry out his plan, already reported to the Patriots, of capturing Adams and Hancock, and of taking or destroying the military stores at Concord. Dr. Warren quickly decided that Paul Revere and William Dawes should go on horseback to Lexington and Concord and give the alarm. He sent them by different routes, hoping that one at least might escape the British patrols with whom Gage had carefully guarded all the roads leading from Boston. Soon Dawes was galloping across Boston Neck, and Paul Revere was getting ready for that long night ride. After arranging with a friend for a lantern signal to be hung in the belfry of the Old North Church to show by which route the British forces were advancing, one if by land and two if by sea, he stepped into a light skiff with two friends who rowed him from Boston across the Charles River to Charlestown. Upon reaching the other side of the river, he obtained a fleet horse and stood ready, bridle in hand, straining his eyes in the darkness to catch sight of the signal lights. The horse waits obedient to his master's touch, and the master stands eagerly watching the spot where the signal is to appear. At 11 o'clock, a light flashes forth. Exciting moment. Then another light. Two if by sea. The British troops are crossing the Charles River to march through Cambridge. No time to lose. Springing into his saddle and spurring his horse, he speeds like the wind towards Lexington. Suddenly, two British officers are about to capture him. He turns quickly, and dashing into a side path with spurs and horse, he is soon far from his pursuers. Then, in his swift flight along the road, he pauses at every house to shout, "Up and arm! Up and arm! The regulars are out! The regulars are out!" Families are roused. Lights gleam from the windows. Doors open and close. Minutemen are mustering. When Lexington is reached, it is just midnight. 8 Minutemen are guarding the house where Adams and Hancock are sleeping. "Make less noise. Don't disturb the people inside," they warn the lusty rider. "Noise," cries Paul Revere. "You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars are out." Soon William Dawes arrived and joined Revere. Hastily refreshing themselves with a light meal, they rode off together toward Concord, in company with Samuel Prescott, a prominent son of liberty whose home was in that town. About halfway there, they were surprised by mounted British officers who called halt. Prescott managed to escape by making his horse leap a stone wall and rode in hot haste to Concord, which he reached in safety, but Paul Revere and William Dawes both fell into the hands of the British. Meantime, the British troops, numbering 800 men, under Lieutenant Colonel Smith, were on their way to Lexington, but before they had gone far, they were made aware by the ringing of church bells, the firing of signal guns, the beating of drums, and the gleaming of beacon fires from the surrounding hilltops that their secret was out, and that the Minutemen knew what was going on. Surprised and disturbed by these signs that the colonists were on the alert, Colonel Smith sent Major Pitcairn ahead with a picked body of troops in the hope that they might reach Lexington before the town could be completely aroused. He also sent back to Boston for more men. The British commander would have still been more disturbed if he had known all that was happening, for the alarm signals were calling to arms thousands of patriots ready to die for their rights. Hastily wakened from sleep, Men snatched their old muskets from over the door, and bidding a hurried goodbye to wife and children, started for the meeting places long before agreed upon. Just as the sun was rising, Major Pitcairn marched into Lexington, where he found 40 or 50 Minutemen ready to dispute his advance. "Disperse, ye rebels, disperse!" he cried, riding up, but they did not disperse. Pitcairn ordered his men to fire, and 18 Minutemen fell to the ground. Before the arrival of Pitcairn, the British officers had captured Revere and Dawes, returned with them. I'm going to start that paragraph over again. Before the arrival of Pitcairn, the British officers who had captured Revere and Dawes returned with them to Lexington, where, commanding Revere to dismount, they let him go. Running off at full speed to the house where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying, he told them what had happened and then guided them across the fields to a place of safety. Leaving the shocked and dazed villagers to collect their dead and wounded, Colonel Smith hastened to Concord. He arrived about 7 in the morning, 6 hours after Dr. Prescott had given the alarm. There had been time to hide the military stores, so the British could not get at those, but they cut down the Liberty Pole, set fire to the courthouse, spiked a few cannon, and emptied some barrels of flour. About 200 of them stood guard at the North Bridge, while a body of Minutemen gathered on a hill on the opposite side. When the Minutemen had increased to 400, they advanced to the bridge and brought on a fight which resulted in loss of life on both sides. Then, pushing on across the bridge, they forced the British to withdraw into the town. The affair had become more serious than the British had expected. Even in the town they could not rest, for an ever-increasing body of Minutemen kept swarming into Concord from every direction. By noon, Colonel Smith could see that it would be unwise to delay the return to Boston. So, although his men had marched 20 miles and had had little or no food for 14 hours, he gave them the order for the return march. But when they started back, the Minutemen kept after them and began a deadly attack. It was an unequal fight. The Minutemen, trained to woodland warfare, slipped from tree to tree, shot down the worn and helpless British soldiers, and then retreated only to return and repeat the harassing attack. The wooded country through which they were passing favored this kind of fighting, but even in the open country, every stone wall and hill, every house and barn seemed to the exhausted British troops to bristle with the guns of Minutemen. The retreating army dragged wearily forward, fighting as bravely as possible, but on the verge of confusion and panic. They reached Lexington Common at 2 o'clock, quite overcome with fatigue. There they were met by 1,200 fresh troops under Lord Percy, whose timely arrival saved the entire force from capture. Lord Percy's men formed a square for the protection of the retreating soldiers, and into it they staggered, falling upon the ground with their tongues hanging out of their mouths like those of dogs after a chase. After resting for an hour, the British again took up their march to Boston. The Minutemen, increasing in numbers every moment, kept up the same kind of running attack that they had made between Concord and Lexington until, late in the day, the Redcoats came under the protection of the guns of the war vessels in Boston Harbor. The British had failed. There was no denying that. They had been driven back, almost in a panic, to Boston with a loss of nearly 300 men. The Americans had not lost 100. Paul Revere's Ride is from The Landlord's Tale by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, "If the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. one if by land, and 2 if by sea. And I, on the opposite shore, will be ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm for the country folk to be up and to arm." Then he said good night, and with muffled oars silently rowed to the Charlestown shore. Just as the moon rose over the bay, where swinging wide at her moorings lay the Somerset, British man of war, a phantom ship, with each mast and spar across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend, through alley and street, wanders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms and the tramp of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed to the tower of the old North Church by the wooden stairs with stealthy tread, to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perth on the somber rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade, by the trembling ladder, steep and tall, to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down a moment on the roofs of the town, and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath, in the churchyard, lay the dead in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear, like a sentinel's tread, the watchful night wind as it went creeping along from tent to tent, and seemed to whisper, "All is well." A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour, and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead, for suddenly all his thoughts are bent on a shadowy something far away, where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred, with a heavy stride on the opposite shore, walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, now gazed at the landscape far and near, then, impetuous, stamped the earth, and turned and tightened his saddle girth. But mostly he watched with eager search the belfry tower of the Old North Church, as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still. And lo, as he looks, on the belfry's height a glimmer, and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle, the bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes, till full on his sight a second lamp in the belfry burns. A hurry of hooves in the village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath, from the pebbles, in passing, a spark struck out by a steed flying fearless and fleet. That was all. And yet, through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night, and the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. He has left the village and mounted the steep, and beneath him, tranquil and broad and deep, is the mystic meeting the ocean tides, and under the alders that skirt its edge, now soft on the sand, now loud on the ledge, is heard the tramp of his steed as he rides. It was 12 by the village clock when he crossed the bridge into Medford town. He heard the crowing of the cock and the barking of the farmer's dog, and felt the damp of the river fog that rises after the sun goes down. It was 1 by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington. He saw the gilded weathercock swim in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting-house windows, blank and bare, gaze at him with a spectral glare, as if they already stood aghast at the bloody work they would look upon. It was 2 by the village clock when he came to the bridge in Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of birds among the trees, and felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing over the meadows brown. and one was safe and asleep in his bed, who at the bridge would be first to fall, who that day would be lying dead, pierced by a British musket ball. You know the rest, in the books you have read, how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again under the trees at the turn of the road, and only pausing to fire and load. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and town and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For, born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere.